but he probably needs to use my. If I want to introduce, I'd like to introduce a little bit of Nicholas Hartlep. He's an assistant professor in Department of Education, Administration, and Foundations at the University of Minnesota. You know, if you search, I searched it on the University website. His research area or interest areas include adoption. This is exactly this area. Asian American education, biracial, multiracial education, and several other. I'm very, very interested actually. Personally, I like to take some his classes very interesting. Also, he has several books he wrote, and some of them just listed. The modern minority stereotype, demystifying Asian American success, the modern minority stereotype reader, critical and challenging readings for the 21st century, and so more. So if you probably search it, Nicholas Hartlep or the Amazon.com, they list it better than I do. So he has a number of books. And today, this is the title he's talking about, Korean adopted modern minorities toward a relational understanding of cultural citizenship, political economy, and the identity of the transracial Korean adoptees. And I don't want to miss that. And after this seminar in refreshments, we have refreshments downstairs, so we can talk about it a little more. Welcome, Mr.
Okay. I was just sitting over here just trying to collect my thoughts because whenever I talk about this, it's real personal as well as professional. And so I'm really humbled, Ji-young, that you allowed me to talk today. And I want to acknowledge Dr. Jung in the audience, who's been a really good mentor and friend to me and has really helped me on this path. I call it towards recovery, but the title of my talk today is Our Korean Adoptees, Model Minorities Toward a Relational Understanding of Cultural Citizenship, Political Economy, and the Identity of Transracial Korean Adoptees. So there again, you can tell that I'm an academic because the title is really long. But if you don't know what a model minority is, Asians are, I guess, the more current contemporary model minority. Jews were previously considered model minorities. I guess to some extent they still are. And there's a few facets that I'd like to point out that are kind of overlapping with my story and my talk today. And that being quiet, happy, well-adjusted, few problems, passive, and perfect. So growing up I was, and I guess I am, a perfectionist. I attempt to be perfect in everything I do. I'm not quiet, but as you'll tell in this story, earlier on in my life I was, and then I became more outspoken when I got older. So what I thought I would do is just kind of define this term political economy for you all, and remind myself why I use this title in the title of today's talk. But political economy, as I'm defining it, is the theory or study of the role of public policy in influencing the economic and social welfare of a political unit and or people. So for Korean adoptees, excuse me, like myself, I was born in Seoul and I came to the United States when I was 2 years of age. There's definitely political economy going on. And so with that, I'd like to show a video, and let me just forewarn you, it might offend some people. So use it, I guess, watch the video as an educational moment, and then I'd like to then discuss after the video. So I'll play the video now, and then I'll resume talking.
most difficult things about international adoption, because generally it's also an interracial adoption, is that the rest of the world does not see you as a real family, because you are not a biological family, and you are required to respond to that all of the time.
When you adopt transracially, people will ask you questions. Some people are just curious, others may be passing judgment. While you're not obliged to answer to strangers, you will need to answer to your children. We've put together this final video session to help prepare you for these questions and to broaden your knowledge about these issues. Then you can decide how to address them with your family. Most of these questions relate to your child not looking like the rest of your family. Beth Hall, who specializes in transracial adoption, told us a story about one dad who helped his son face a difficult question.
Jimmy, is that your dad? Is that your dad? Now Jimmy is walking next to his dad, tall, white, Nordic-looking guy, and here's this brown-skinned, shorter child. And Jimmy turned to his little new friend that he was probably trying to impress, trying to fit in with, and said, "No, that's not my dad." And this particular dad did the most incredible job of parenting. They got in the car, and this dad turned to his little boy and said, "Jimmy, I just want you to know, I know you love me." What did that dad do right there? He understood it wasn't about him. It's hard for kids. It's painful to have to constantly be answering these questions.
I do remember people asking me, "Is that your brother?" and nobody believing me.
People would come up and say, "Oh, where did you get these girls? Where did they come from? Are they really sisters?"
How much did you pay for that child? Or,
In China.
They'll ask you, they'll ask you what your income level is. Just what we consider to be really intrusive questions. It's just out there, above board and a matter for public discussion.
You may not be able to believe that people really do ask these kinds of questions, but be prepared. These questions can annoy you because they seem ignorant, but there are other kinds of questions that can give you pause because they come from people who are informed about global politics and socioeconomic reform. These questions may be the most difficult for you because they reveal just how complicated international adoption can be.
Why the heck did you go all the way to China when, you got a whole bunch of kids here who need help?
Ever since the 1970s, there has been less white babies available for adoption. And today, white infants are the most desirable still because those who adopt tend to be white. And so there's less supply of white infants, and there is still a stronger demand for that.
The question of whether or not to adopt from the foster care system or adopt internationally is a complicated issue, and each family is going to approach that a little bit differently.
We chose to adopt from China as opposed to trying for a domestic adoption because in many respects we thought it was easy, quite frankly. We were told that domestic adoptions take a lot of time and a lot of trouble. And also my wife and I felt that we did want to adopt a child from our own ethnic background.
The possibility of local adoption, domestic adoption, is something that merits further thought, research at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
We've always been fixated on international adoption, I think primarily because of the diversity issue, that we just find that appealing, that we would be adopting from another culture.
They told us that, explicitly that these children coming from foster homes or needing foster homes can have very, intense emotional problems, behavioral problems, medical problems, and we didn't think that we could handle that.
In the United States, most of the children that are available for adoption are older children. By older, I would say 5 years to 21 years. Most of the children internationally that are available for adoption are much younger. I hope that we can open our hearts to domestic children who might not be 6 months old, but at 6 years old are desperate in need of a family. And they and their sister or their brother need a family in America to nurture and help them.
Birth parents or birth mothers in the United States are able to have more power in the decision on where they get to choose to place their children.
When we talk to people who are going through it or what you would have to do, it felt like almost like an audition. You know, the birth mother would have to approve.
You know, it's not just about the adopted child, it's not just about the adoptive family, but the birth mothers in many instances are making extraordinary decisions and selfless decisions to provide life, and knowing they can't provide the kind of home that their child needs, being willing to open up avenues for that child to be adopted.
A younger man came up to us and asked us how much I paid for her. And she asked me, "Did you pay for me?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "Well, how much did I cost?" I said, "Well, you know, Noelle, when moms and dads have a baby biologically, they have to pay the doctor, they have to pay the hospital, and so their fees. And when we became a family, I had similar fees."
While Deb's explanation was fine for her daughter, who was 7 or 8 at the time, specialists also suggest parents understand the larger issue of adoption and money.
Okay, so what does the $36.50 convert to?
3,000 is the orphanage donation. The 1,700 approximately is the legal fees. 380 visa fee to the U.S. consulate, and then 500 yuan for the child visa.
When you go to China, and then you have to bring this amount of U.S. cash. You got to give this amount of cash to this person, this amount of cash to another person, this amount of Chinese currency, and all this stuff. Then it becomes really strange, bringing that cash with you and paying these people, and then at that point it almost becomes, it seems like it's a business.
The fact that there are now tens of thousands of people coming from around the world with stacks of $100 bills in their hand, ready to adopt Chinese children, has turned a well-intentioned program into a marketplace of sorts.
Well, I mean, the money issue is a really hard thing to talk about in adoption. Naturally there are costs in running this whole process.
In terms of private adoption, if it's done by a licensed agency, can cost anywhere from maybe $7,000 to over $40,000 plus. Again, it depends on the type of child that one is seeking. In international adoption, it can be conducted by a licensed private nonprofit organization or agency, or a for-profit attorney.
I think that the commodity aspect of international adoption is very, very troubling. Very troubling. It's something when you're a new parent, you just don't really want to believe it. There is a slight, let's be honest, no family building in the West is free, So saying that there's money involved, well, there's money involved in giving birth to a child too. So it's not just money that makes it dirty. But there is a commodification in international adoption, and there's no way around that. It's definitely happening.
Unfortunately, adoption is a business. It shouldn't be, because children and money should never be mixed.
We know that, unfortunately, trafficking and abduction of kids in China, particularly southern China, is quite typical because the Chinese state press tells us that, and the Chinese state press can't report such a sensitive thing without the authority of the state.
When parents ask me the question about how are we supposed to respond to our child who's wondering about child trafficking in Guatemala, the first thing I let them know is please validate and acknowledge that that is a reality, because if you do not talk about it with your child, they are going to be hearing about it and talking about it with people at school, strangers on the street, needs to be you.
I'm only responsible for it. That's my defensive part of it, saying, who are you to criticize me? I'm a good person. I'm not doing any human rights violations. But it's a very, very complicated issue.
I think one of the biggest obstacles right now that the field needs to look at is the issue of money, and in particular in international adoption, the problem of child trafficking. I think that right now, child trafficking and trafficking of persons in general is a huge political issue. And I think that, unfortunately, often legal international adoption is collapsed with child trafficking and becomes fodder for kind of a movement to stop international adoption. The fact is that there's almost an estimated 148 million orphans in the world, and international adoption is never going to address the needs of all those children. However, international adoption can be an option for a small number of those children. And I think it's important that we maintain that as an option. Again, it's not a perfect solution. There's no perfect solution to the number of abandoned children in the world.
It's about going to other places in the world and helping those countries to look at their social service networks, to help build capacity for them to improve their social networks, but to say, what, while you're building, while you're growing, while we're helping you, kids need homes.
The Hague Convention is an international treaty, but it is an international treaty that arises from what is called the private law system. The desire for such a convention or such a treaty was largely in response to the recognition that a number of children were being shifted or trafficked from one part of the world to the other parts of the world without much record of where they came from, where they were going, and most importantly, without much accountability as to what happened to them over time.
The Hague was ratified in April of 2008, and for the U.S., the U.S. was a signator on the Hague for many years, but it took a long time for the U.S. to be able to ratify the Hague Convention. And so what it means for child trafficking for children who are adopted to the U.S. from other countries is that parents have to go through additional trainings, and there has to be more assurances on the part of the sending countries that those children were in fact relinquished for adoption or abandoned and were not trafficked in any way, coercion, payment, or any of those other things that are likened to some form of trafficking didn't exist.
When adoption researchers speak about adoption at a larger global level, international socioeconomics becomes an issue because we have to think about which groups are adopting and which groups are being adopted.
Certainly, I see that there are children in the world who are in bad situations, who need to be in different situations. The question for me, and I think where I want to complicate it more, is why does that have to mean white Americans remove these children from their countries? The fact that it's rich countries that adopt from poor countries, even though I think a lot of parents think that sort of equalizes inequities between countries, in reality, at least the way I see it, the inequity begets transnational adoption. If this was a world where there was true economic, social equity across nations, across hemispheres, what you would see is transnational adoption that was completely deracialized, whereas at the moment, transnational adoption is highly racialized, where the adoptive parents tend to be one race and the adoptees are of another race.
You may find it hard to agree with the point Kim's making. It's a tough concept, but one you may want to consider as you watch these next two families.
The best thing that a parent can offer is a loving, safe environment where they can grow up very nurtured and be a positive contribution to society. And so, yeah, there are factors, but everybody's got issues. Regardless whether they're your biological children or adopted children, they have issues. And we have our issues, and that's just the fact that he's slightly different by the color of his skin.
Well, we had tried for so long to have our own child, and we were unsuccessful. So then we decided, why not consider adoption?
So the fact that I spent some time in Sweden and
And then after the Army, I went back to Sweden and performed for a while. And I got to know people and musicians in Sweden, and I liked it. I had a wonderful time there, and I kind of got connected to the Swedish culture.
There's a lot of people going there, and we saw all the news reports of all the violence and the terrorism and all the things. And we wanted to take a child out of that horrific area to give them someplace safe, someplace where they didn't hear a bomb go off or a siren every second. So we decided there because of those things. And it's just something about the photograph that we saw, and then we went over there and met him.
I love him very much, and he's my son.
Well, I obviously am not Swedish, but we are open-minded, and we feel that we have provided a very good life for her. And we are definitely open to her learning more about the Swedish culture, and we certainly still go there to Sweden periodically, and that seems to be enough.
What is it about these families that isn't quite right? We're not used to international adoptive families looking like this, sounding like this. They're actors. We couldn't find internationally adopted families like these. Why is that? Thinking about this can give us the opportunity to ask ourselves honestly, why don't we see these kinds of families?
It's not hard to see that there's a sliding scale of adoption fees. Caucasian infants cost, quote unquote, the most, and I know people don't like to hear it that way, but we have to be honest about what's going on. And then it goes down from there according to the race of the child. So there is a racial hierarchy. I mean, this exists. We have stereotypes. We have more negative stereotypes about certain racial groups than others. And that's a problem. And we don't like to talk about it, especially those of us that are white. We don't know how to talk about race. We're afraid to talk about it. We think it's politically not correct. But if we don't talk about it, we can't change it.
Instead of bringing them into our country and adopting them into our families, perhaps we should be sending money over there to help them stay with their families. Or we should be sending money over there to develop the adoption systems within that particular country so that those children can be placed with other families. And there are families in every country that would like to adopt. Only as the last resort should children be taken for international adoption and placed out of their country into a different country. Now, I think people who are antagonistic toward international adoption forget the fact that a child's brain is a perishable commodity, and that if a child has to spend time being deprived, if a child has to spend time within an environment that is not conducive to normal development, that child can have permanent effects. So there needs to be a time frame in which that child can be either placed for domestic adoption or placed for international adoption.
Adoption is complex. I mean, it's incredibly complicated. It's passionate and emotional. And yet, what's important to always remember is that adoption is for children to have families, not for families to have children. And so the policies and practices of agencies, of individuals, that has to be the primary consideration. Families for children, not children for families.
We want this companion series to help your family start talking about adoption. Hopefully, at some point during these 5 sessions, you were surprised, challenged, and inspired. In this series, we've asked you to examine your intentions, understand some of the parenting issues in adoption, explore the nuances of being a multiracial family, and commit to building a healthy identity for your transracial adoptee. We hope you feel empowered to create a healthy, intimate family.
Okay, so it's a heavy topic, I know. So I'd like to talk to you about cultural citizenship, how I conceptualize this and how it fits with today's talk. There's really 4 overarching components of it. The first is a socio-political and geopolitical awareness. So in the video, they talked about understanding trafficking, understanding race, culture, money. And it's interesting because there is research that documents that white people have a hard time talking about race and have a hard time talking about money. And so the things in brackets are what I perceive as being problems in adopted families. So if there's an unawareness of these issues, then there's not it's not ideal. Let's put it that way. Ethno-racial awareness, again in brackets, colorblindness. I wrote a piece called "Cultural Citizenship, Not Colorblindness." So society is very colorblind. We don't like to talk about race. We say we have Barack Obama, so we're post-racial. Race doesn't matter. Well, if you believe that, and you have an adoptee, a transracial adoptee, you're going to confront problems there. Being proactive rather than reactive. So the fact that you're here at Korean school, that's being proactive. As opposed to, in my situation, you're 18 years old and then you're talking about these tough issues that should have been talked about many years ago. And ethno-relativism as opposed to ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is this idea like, right, centralizing your own culture and ways of knowing, and saying everyone else is abnormal or different, compared to an ethno-relative where you can have your own culture, but it is in comparison in relationship to others, and it doesn't delegitimize other people's ways of knowing and understanding the world. Equally, it doesn't say that yours is better or superior. So ethno-relativism is super important. So I'd like to just briefly, before I talk about cultural citizenship, point out, I'm sure you've seen these covers when you go to Meijer or in town grocery shopping. And I'd like to point out, they are racialized, as the video said. Typically, the mother is white. Oftentimes the father is white as well. And the baby can or cannot be, at times, white. But for the most time, it's whites adopting children of a different race and culture. I really have a hard time, and it's a very personal and very visceral response because I am an adopted kid. When society tells us that it is almost you're being a saint when you're adopting a kid like this. And what do I mean by that? Well, Sandra Bullock, that video really offends me in ways that the Blind Side movie offended me, of her adopting, her acting the part, but adopting a black boy who ends up becoming a NFL player. And, people will say to me, but Nicholas, why are you so critical? Because it's based on a true story. Are you saying we can't have movies on true stories? That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is society tends to cherry pick the anecdotes and stories because, bottom line, people has to make money. They have to sell magazine covers. They have to sell subscriptions. So another thing that I observe is people this magazine tends to really buy into this discourse of transracial adoption. So here you have Angela Jolie and an adopted son. And there's many other. You can just get on Google and type in transracial people covers, and you'll see tons of different actors and actresses. What do I mean by adoption and adaptation? Well, I think from a macro level that people adopt, but the child has to adapt, as opposed to a family adopts a child and they all work together and they become one, and they become multicultural and ethno-relative. What I see oftentimes is the child, especially if they're youngsters, they're beholden to what their parents tell them. And that's really problematic if the parent has no awareness of what the child is going through. So here are some other examples. Another thing, I understand that these magazines have to be very aesthetically pleasing, otherwise no one's going to buy a cover that looks, unprofessional and unhappy. Like, who would want to buy a magazine where the mother's like sad or something, right? But again, this feeds into this discourse that adoption is a happy thing. Now, understandably, hear me when I say this, there are great adoptee families, but understand that we cannot make a fairy tale out of adoption. And if it's your fairy tale, it's dangerous, because if you tell your kid it's a fairy tale, they may internalize that, and there are going to be implications and consequences for that. So what I'm saying is this, and forgive me, but I'm using Korean adoptees as an example. That there's your Korean identity before adoption and or after, and then there's an American identity, but then there's this middle space, and we have to be relative to that. We have to understand that in many ways you're biracial, you're bicultural, there's a hybridity or an intersectionality that is required to understand identity, right? So for me, there are many things I have to consider that go into my identity. There's my occupation, there's my race, there's the fact I was adopted, there's my heterosexual identity, there's my Christian identity, there's my age, there's the fact that I live in Bloomington, Illinois, in central Illinois, that's flat and very windy and a lot of cornfields, right? All these things make me and inform who I am. Family status, my adoptive family got divorced when I was young, at about 8. So that's part of my identity. So you get the picture that our identities are more than just really categorical, simple things, because they intersect and they contradict at times, right? So my identity is that I'm a critical race theorist, and I write about racism, and I write about capitalism. I'm anti-capitalism, but then yet I will go down to Target and Walmart. So that's in some ways a contradiction, right? Because I write how Walmarts do bad things to communities, but yet I'm paying money there. So we have to understand that at times our identities are conflicting. It's at this point that I'd like to share what do I mean by cultural citizenship, and then I guess the talk will be over. And I apologize, typically I don't read from notes when I give talks, but this is an area, this topic really leaves no room for mistake. So I needed to capture my thoughts concisely and cogently. So I wrote, I'm not a white wannabe, although I used to be one when I was unaware of my racial and ethnic identity. Being aware of one's race is problematic for everyone, but especially for adoptees. As a Korean and transracial adoptee growing up with white adoptive parents, I never problematized my ethno-racial identity. My identity was by and large given to me ahead of time, a priori, by white outsiders who neither knew me nor what it was like to be an adoptee. I internalized their whiteness, and I started to believe that I was white. I remember this, looking into the mirror one day, and I was like, why do I look different? And my story is similar to other adoptees. It finally became clear to me when my parents were getting divorced that I was not white. I looked at several family photographs and I started to ask myself questions such as, who am I? Where did I come from? And that lady on the movie who said their kid said, how much did you pay for me? I've asked that question. I said, Mom, I remember, how much did you pay for me? And she looked at me and said, what? Like, where did that come from? But that's real. That's real talk here. Why did my parents adopt me? Am I really Korean? Why can't I speak Korean? Why did my parents have this idea that I should learn Spanish? Numerous questions emerged from my this racial awakening, and I quickly grew tired of my adoptive family's unwillingness to address racism and my identity as an adopted family member, right? I decided to bottle this up, and like the first slide, I was really quiet, because there's no point of talking about it if no one's going to engage you in a dialogue, right? So I just shut up and I didn't rock the boat. I did my best to appear happy on the outside, right? Be perfect. But on the inside, I was completely devastated and disempowered. Many times I hear this being referred to as the elephant in the room that no one sees or talks about. I do not think the elephant metaphor is accurate for such situations. A better metaphor would be adoptive white family members' reluctance to talk about race is like a tumor that, if not removed, grows and becomes malignant, spreading throughout the ravaging a person's body. The mismatch between the worldview of adoptive parents and adoptees' realities can grow so large that it can kill family relationships, like a tumor kills the host organism. I don't have a good relationship with my adoptive mother. I haven't talked to her for probably 3 years now. She hasn't seen Olivia, her third granddaughter. This is serious business, what I'm talking about today. Being adopted transracially complicates adoptees' worldviews and is problematic in many areas of life, especially when the adoptive family who does not address racism and culture. How do colorblind adoptive parents present their adopted children to others? How do adoptees, especially children, present their own identities to schoolmates? As a minoritized and racialized immigrant, I'm on the road of self-empowerment, and I'm glad that I finally found my biological father in Korea. I felt that many were trying to dissuade me from searching. But when I found my birth father, my feeling of searching from him was the right decision. It was vindicated, that decision. Through this experience, I feel compelled to inform adoptive parents to stop romanticizing their adopted children's realities. I often ask myself, who evaluates my experiences as an adoptee in a society and world that is racist, that gives rise to these, what gives rise to these evaluations? What makes adoptees a vulnerable population, especially Koreans who do not fit neatly into our society's black and white race dichotomy? I also want to encourage adoptees who are going to see this video or are in the room who have not yet initiated a family birth search to try to find their biological family. Not every searcher will find his or her biological family, but in the process of searching, one can find oneself, and I did. There's a book called Dance of Identities by John Palmer. I'm friends with him. He's a Korean adoptee. He lives out in Boston. And he wrote a book, Dance of Identities. I read it when I was doing my dissertation, and it changed my life in a good way. Adoptive parents who are white need to recognize the pervasiveness of privilege and power that's inherent in transracial adoption situations, right? If you've read the book Eve Bunting's Jin Woo, it's a children's book about adopted family, you know, what a terrible book. The book is reminiscent of my own adoption story, and that my adopted parents, like the parents in the book, never traveled to Korea to pick me up. Also, the adopted parents of Jin Woo, like my own, present the adoption process as nothing but idyllic. This is a very one-sided narration, and I feel compelled to discuss 3 takeaway points to prospective or current adoptive families and that you should ponder, and then I'll wrap it up. 3 points. Point 1. Become cultural citizens for your children. What does this mean? It doesn't mean food and festivals. But clearly we need those. We need to eat food, we need to have festivals and celebrate of Korean culture. But rather this means that as parents of Korean children, you must be connoisseurs of what it means to be a Korean. This may require getting involved in culture or educational groups like Korean Academy. Reading books is a good way to start. Videos are excellent. Korean adoptee adults may well ask their parents later on why they did not instill Korean experiences and cultural understandings in their lives. This is especially the case when adopting young or infant children who may not have any memories of their native country. There's a great book I read, Parenting as Adoptees, and it's interesting. If you have an adopted child, it's not just raising them that's difficult. It's how that child, that adopted kid, will be a father or mother to his or her own children, and or adopt his or her own child. Becoming a cultural citizen also means that your racial and cultural identity is different from your Korean child's. To make up for this deficit requires some changes in behavior. For example, when your child brings up race, you need to talk about it and be honest. It also means that if your child does not bring up issues of race, you must be brave and break the ice. Parents of all minority kids need to talk about racism that exists all around us, and the fact that Asian Americans are not immune from it. It's not simply something black people endure. Becoming a cultural citizenship for your child also means that you're not helping and you're not learning if you do not actively seek out Koreans for your assistance. I've learned so many. I mentioned Dr. Jung invited me to Bible study, Tom Park, other Koreans, different generational, different ages, to talk about and do life together and to mentor one another. If you don't have friends who are Koreans, then you need to get some. Transracial adopted parents need to move outside of their comfort level in terms of their normal social interactions. If the parents are white, this means that they need to gain and build friendships with people of color, especially Koreans, like I just said. Have play dates, socialize, cook food, eat kimchi together, do whatever it means to be Korean. Segregation has led many whites to rarely cross paths with people of color. MLK said it this way. He said, the most segregated day of the week is Sunday, and he was referring to church. We have Korean church here. It's an excellent resource to come and to participate in service. Whites also attend churches that are predominantly white, shop at grocery stores that service predominantly white people, and send their children to schools that are predominantly white. Not becoming a cultural citizen for your child can prevent children from having needed social experiences with people that are different than themselves, right? All right, point 1 was long, point 2 is shorter. Point 2, it won't go away by itself. If you do not discuss race, power, and privilege on a consistent basis, do not believe that the tumor that I discussed earlier, not the elephant in the room, but the tumor, it won't go away, right? Adopted Korean children will endure stereotypes and racialized identities such as the model minority, yellow peril, perpetual foreigner, or fill in the blank, right? If you have a young lady, a young girl, when they get older, and they were never aware that there is a genre of adult film industry about Asian women, that is going to be a devastating hit on their identity, right? Equally for men. If you don't talk to your little boy that the nerd construction and the effeminate non-jock is really problematic, you're going to be in for problems. I mean, Jeremy Lin aside, Asian men are stereotyped in really nasty ways. As a parent and guardian, it is your responsibility to discuss with your children that all these pejoratives and even these positive stereotypes have two common themes: racism and white privilege. As an adoptee, I faced all of these stereotypes and stigmas. I wish my adopted parents had discussed the existence of such stereotypes with me. If they had, I would not have had to feel that I was a Twinkie. And you know what a Twinkie is, right? Yellow on the outside and white on the inside. Point 3, coming to terms with the motivation for transracial adoption. The video that we began today's talk with, unpack this. Let me add my nuance to it for a moment, and then I will conclude today's talk. If you are unwilling to come to terms with why you chose to adopt a Korean child, the unspoken message to your children is that colorblindness is okay. My adopted parents have not been able or willing to tell me why they adopted me. Their stock response is that they wanted a child and that Korea had many children in need of a home. I encourage prospective adoptive parents to understand themselves and what is motivating them to adopt transracial. You know, whether it be infertility, or you're going to save the world, or God told you to adopt a child, you need to acknowledge that. The last slide said, families for children, not children for families. I think that's really true, right? According to one website that handles Korean adoptees, the fees total approximately $18,000 to adopt. Not only is this a lot of money, but it comes with an additional cost that is not quantified on the tally sheet. The special cross-cultural challenges of race and identity that I've discussed today. I think even Illinois State and other employees, they even give, they have programs to help offset and defray costs. Adopting children are expensive, right? Families who are financially able to afford adopting must also be emotionally able to talk to their adopted children about why they felt the need to adopt. Yes, there are medical reasons to adopt, I understand, and there are reasons, I understand. However, the simple reply that Korean children are in need of a loving home, what my parents said to me, is not sufficient. If you are unwilling to come to terms with why you chose to, or you're choosing to adopt a Korean child, the unspoken message to your children is that colorblindness is okay. As a white adoptive parent, you are privileged, and not understanding why you adopt your child is a form of colorblindness, because race is always at play. In effect, you are saying that you do not see the tumor that continues to grow in size and seriousness. Okay, my last comments. My plea to adoptive parents and or people who are considering adoption is to take the process seriously and to realize that you are becoming more than adoptive parents or surrogate parents. You are, or you should be, becoming cultural citizens for your children. You will not be able to understand fully what your adopted children face or experience. I get that, and that's okay. The best way to persevere is to be honest with yourself and your family. Talk about race and talk about feelings. Speak with your adopted child frequently and reassure him or her that although you are white, you are willing to jointly learn about Korean culture with them. Right? It's not one parent does it, the other parent doesn't. Both parents have to be committed and sold out to this process. Acknowledge your fallibility and avoid romanticizing the adoption process. Lastly, encourage your child to conduct a birth search if he or she feels compelled to do so. Now, if you're 8 years of age, that's probably not an appropriate time to do that. But when you're old enough, certainly, I think it's a good thing to do. Lastly, I just need to say, everything that I've said are my opinions and my experiences, although there are countless books, articles, videos, documentaries that would support everything that I've said today. And so I just like to say that, that I'm honored that I was able to share my feelings today. So thank you, Ji Young, and everyone that made this process happen. And I just look forward to hearing your thoughts. So thank you very much.
Any questions? We have some Q&A sessions after this. So if you have any personally or any question about this regarding the same.